This week in the Regency, we have a story that is both fascinating and ultimately sad. The story of a once respectable but ill-fated gentleman named Henry Fauntleroy. Now, if you're wondering why that name's familiar to you, it's because the woman who wrote The Secret Garden, Frances Hodgson Burnett, also wrote a book called Little Lord Fauntleroy, and that was a huge success and also a film. It was like a tearjerker, sentimental Victorian melodrama. I read it when I was 9 and loved it, and I really don't want to go back and read it again because I know I won't now. So where did this story come from? And I have to admit, I'm fudging a little bit. The things I'm going to read to you today are from 1824, September and October 1824. But the crimes of Henry Fauntleroy came in the Regency in 1815, 1415, and so on, and started early in 1815. So he just sneaks in. He is a Regency criminal. It's just that he wasn't discovered until 1824 after George IV took the throne. So, but it's such a story, and it's a story that interested me in a couple of ways. I found it because I was looking to find out whether my character, my main character, Lady Miranda Harwood, could have had her own bank account as a widow. And also in the process of that, kept coming across this term banking house. Not like Bank of England or Child's Bank, but banking house. And I wanted to find out what that meant. And it turned out that a banking house is kind of halfway between a bank and a stockbroker, almost literally. They are the people who tell the brokers on the floor to buy particular stocks, and they are the people who then lodge those stocks with the Bank of England and draw on the bank for their clients. And I'm imagining they do a lot of other things, including they have safety deposit boxes and all that kind of stuff. And this was about a particular banking house, Marsh, Stracey, Graham and Fauntleroy. And they suddenly stopped trading in September of 1824. Extraordinary affair. Our readers must have observed a singular address yesterday signed by Messrs. W. Marsh, J. H. Stracey and G. E. Graham, partners of a most respectable banking house in the West End of the town, announcing a determination to suspend payment for the present on account of the extraordinary conduct of Mr. Fauntleroy, a partner of that house. The extraordinary conduct here alluded to is understood to be an extensive forgery on the Bank of England, with which that gentleman stands charged. An examination which has been continued for several days has taken place in the private house of Mr. Conant, into the particulars of which we do not feel ourselves warranted to enter. Mind you, a lot of other, this is the Times, a lot of other newspapers did enter into it at length. Suffice it to say that the examination has led to the commitment of Mr. Fauntleroy. So an examination was what we would now call a committal hearing, where the magistrates interrogated witnesses with aid from a prosecutor to see if there was enough evidence to justify a trial. And in this case, there was so much evidence, so much. And normally there was only one examination, as normally there's only one committal hearing. But over the next month, the Bank of England was alerted to this particular forgery. So they examined all of the accounts that he had power of attorney over, and just kept discovering new thefts. So what did he actually do? People were clients of his. I'm going to use one name in particular, Miss Frances Young, because she's the one who first testifies against him in the examination. And also, it proves for me that Lady Miranda could in fact have an account. So she's his client. She gives him a power of attorney to buy certain stocks for her. And so he then buys those stocks for her, those, and in particular, in this case, government bonds called consols, also called the 3%. They were government bonds that had no end date and that paid you 3% interest every year. And he bought those and he lodged them in her account at the Bank of England. So she had an account with the Bank of England. And that answered my first question. So, and then he forged another power of attorney giving him the right to sell those stocks for her. But of course he didn't give that money to her, he kept the money. And the reason he wasn't discovered for 10 years, he did this to a lot of people, like a lot of people. £170,000 worth of money he took. The reason he wasn't discovered for 10 years is he kept paying the dividends. He kept paying the 3%. And I can't help but feel that once he was discovered, those people were worse off. Like, okay, he had taken their capital, but on a day-to-day basis, they were worse off because they no longer got their dividends. And I can't help but feel that some of them would be cross that this was in fact discovered before their death. He was lucky nobody died, actually. So this caused a huge furore, as you can imagine. This banking house had a lot of clients. And as far as I can figure out, the clients were of what probably Hare would call the middling sort. You know, there were no lords involved or ladies, but they were clearly, you know, reasonably respectable, reasonably well-off people. There were some charities. He stole from his own mother and his brother, who was a lawyer. So it was that kind of family. How did it happen? And this is where we get two entirely different theories of the crime. His theory, the one that he explains in his trial, was that when he took over his father's job, his father was one of the founding members of this banking house, he retired, and Henry, who had been working as a clerk in another banking house, he came in to take his father's job. The other three people, Marsh, Stracey and Graham, they were silent partners. One of them was a colonel who was off most of this time fighting Napoleon and when he first took over. And so they had no skills, they had jobs they had to do every month, but they didn't actually understand what was going on. And his father had been the person who ran the business. When he took over the business, he found out that they were severely in debt, £120,000 to one particular creditor. And there was no way they could pay it. There was no way they could pay, you know, the installments that they were supposed to pay. Now, at that point, he should have claimed bankruptcy. He should have admitted the terrible state that they were all in. And if he had done that, his clients' monies would have been safe in the Bank of England, as safe as the Bank of England is said for a reason. Okay, so why didn't he? I think there's a couple of reasons. The main one being that his father would have been in real trouble. I mean, it would have been his fault that the other three lost everything, the other three partners, and it would have been a terrible disgrace for the family. And instead of manning up, basically, he was not a person who manned up much, really. He was not brave. Instead of doing that, he stole to kind of keep them buoyant. And I think possibly he had gone to the Bank of England to ask for help, like to ask for a loan, and they refused it. That's my guess, because he kept a when they finally put a search warrant on his place, he'd kept track of everything. Like, he was too good a banker not to keep track of everything that he'd stolen, you know. And he had this whole ledger with stuff showing what he'd stolen, who he'd stolen it from, how much, when, exactly what day, everything. He said that the bank had failed them, and therefore the bank would smart. Here we could only assume he's talking about the Bank of England. So why am I interested in this? So far it's just an embezzlement case. What I'm fascinated by are completely different accounts of why he did what he did and what kind of person he was. So his account was, well, I took over and everything was in a terrible state and I thought I had to save it. The Times, on the other hand, feel that he's a completely different kind of person. And so they embark on an extraordinary article not long after he's arrested. While the examinations were going on, so it's not sub judice, he hasn't been formally charged yet, and they published a huge amount of stuff about him. Mr. Fauntleroy's family were intimate with a respectable but not an opulent family of the name of Young. That's no relation to Miss Frances Young, from whom he stole. One of the daughters of this family, a handsome young lady, attracted the attachment of Mr. Henry Fauntleroy, and their intercourse, which in those days did not mean sex, ended in Miss Young's giving birth to a child. The young lady's family, on discovering their relation's disgrace, remonstrated with Mr. Fauntleroy and urged the necessity of making the only reparation in his power by marrying the mother of his child. Mr. Fauntleroy, however, felt little disposition to do so, but one of the young lady's brothers, a spirited young man, indignant at the disgrace cast upon his family and name, insisted upon the proper reparation being made, or that Mr. Fauntleroy should choose another alternative. This threat strengthened the determination of Mr. Fauntleroy not to submit to the proposed terms, and arrangements were in progress to settle the matter in the field, which means a duel. So the brother and Henry were going to go out with pistols at dawn. Mr. Fauntleroy's own family, however, now joined their influence and persuasions to those of Miss Young's friends, and he ultimately agreed so far to redeem the lady's character as to become her husband by the tie of the law, but declared that he would never live with her a day after the day of their union. He accordingly led her to the altar, the ceremony was performed, and they left the church together. But when they got outside, he went one way and she went another, and from that time to the present they have never again met. He, however, settled a very handsome annual allowance upon her for her own and her child's support, which they still continue to receive. Now, in court, he talked about this. He talked about this particular article, or he was obviously referring to this article, and refused their perception of what had happened, and said he wasn't going to talk about why they were separated because that was private, but it was absolutely wrong what they have said. The Bath Chronicle says, when her brother discovered the error, she, that is his wife, the woman who became his wife, Miss Young, she had been drawn into, he instantly demanded of Mr. Fauntleroy to acknowledge her publicly as his wife, which he readily consented to do, but begged a short time might be allowed him for the arrangement of his affairs previous to the acknowledgement. During the interval which occurred, his immoralities being discovered, Mrs. H. Fauntleroy's family thought it advisable for her to separate from a man of such dissolute habits, and she has ever since lived under the protection of her mother. The propriety of her conduct is the best testimony that can be offered of her moral rectitude and virtue, and must in the end defeat the efforts of malevolence and scandal. So who is he? Is he the man who refused to marry her, or the man who said, yes, obviously I'll marry her, but I just got to organise things a bit? And then they found out that he has another house with somebody else in it. You know, not so great. So we don't know. We don't know which is true. Is he somebody who was perfectly happy to marry his young lady, and she was kept from him by her family? Or was he the man who said, I'll never live with you. I'll marry, but I won't live with you. Who knows? Perhaps both are true. The Times article then goes on to talk about what happened after the wedding. So this is the article that says she went one way, he went another. And it is absolutely the most critical of him that we have seen. So just after that, according to the Times, being thus shut out from all probable chance of ever entering again the married state, Mr. Fauntleroy began to indulge in the society of a certain description of women about town. Now, this is a very long description of how pigeons were plucked, as the saying was at the time. And I'm actually going to make next week's video all about this because it's absolutely fascinating, including a character called Mother Bang. And I want to dive a little bit more into that. But basically they're saying he's a gambler. Not only a gambler, but also pretty stupid, gullible young man. What the Times also tells us in that article is that some time ago, while in France, he became enamoured of a handsome young English lady, then pursuing her education at a convent, so she'd be Catholic, and succeeded in gaining her affections to the degree that she eloped with him. This lady, who is extremely beautiful, by whom he has 2 lovely children, he has never parted from, and at this moment she occupies an elegant house with a complete establishment, that means servants, in Surrey. She is only now 20 years of age, but her name we decline mentioning. So she's got 2 kids. Later on we find out that the second child's 6 weeks old. So she has to have been no older than 16 when he seduced her. He would have been in his early 40s. He has, since his apprehension, that is his arrest, written several letters to her of the most affectionate, painful and heart-rending description, to which we will not now allude to more particularly, but which do credit to his feelings and his amiability. This establishment is, it seems, settled entirely upon the young female and her children. So in both cases of the women that he was involved with, who had children to him, he ensured that their safety was secure, that their futures were secure. Because he knew he was, presumably because he knew he was on thin ice and that he might get arrested at any time. So what was really interesting to me about this, really interesting, was that in all of the newspaper accounts about this young woman, and there were several, she is portrayed really with dignity and with respect, although she's his mistress. And it brings up for me this thing where we look at the Regency and we're looking back through the lens of the Victorian period, which was very censorious and which would have talked about her being a Scarlet Woman and so on. But in the Regency, we're not getting that. We're just not getting it. We get real disapproval of women who, stole from their clients and so on. But we don't get the disapproval of a young woman who has been seduced and led astray and then set up in the country. And they were living in Surrey as husband and wife under a different name. Nobody knew them there as Fauntleroy. It took the police quite a long time to find the house, in fact, because they were looking for Mr. Fauntleroy. The newspapers don't even mention the village that she's in. So they leave her alone. They respect her privacy. They don't try to interview her. They interview the officer who did the search warrant, and he's clearly on her side, and so is the newspaper. All the newspapers are on her side. They refuse to say her name. They refuse to give details about the children. They refuse to give details about where they were living or what name they were under. And it fascinates me that we have this perception of the 19th century as being, highly moral. But in fact, the Regency did not have that same kind of judgmental attitude to these things that developed with the development of Methodism and Protestantism in Britain. And the second half of the 19th century would have treated this situation very differently indeed. And I think it's important for us to remember that, particularly me when I'm writing Regency. It's like the word pregnant. So we think of pregnant as a word that was not used, it's too indelicate. And that was true in the later Victorian period, but during the Regency it's used quite freely. And so we have a kind of pall cast over things by the Victorian attitude to morality, what they called morality, that kind of obscures our view of the Regency. And I think we have to work quite hard to not let that influence our perceptions of this period. So it was very interesting to me, this whole thing, and particularly interesting because I still, after reading all of this, I've read hundreds of articles now, I still don't really have a sense of Henry Fauntleroy. He was absolutely beloved by his friends. He had 17 character witnesses saying what a gentleman he was. While he was in prison, he was in this prison, the Cold Bath Fields prison, also known as the Steel, very unpleasant place. And yet there was a constant stream of visitors, of friends, family, acquaintances even. And there is this sense, on the one hand, he's a profligate, he keeps women, he does all this sort of stuff. He steals, he forges, he utters. And on the other hand, he's absolutely beloved by everybody who knows him. And so it's really hard to discern whether or not he was a complete con artist or whether he was a genuinely nice person who got caught up in this desire to save his father's company and just kept going wrong. Now, the one bit of information we have about him that makes me inclined towards the con artist is that he seduced a young woman, a teenager, away from her convent. So he had no trouble debauching a young woman, knowing he could marry her because he was already married. So that, to me, inclines me towards the con artist side of things. But we'll never really know. He was convicted of uttering. So, it's lovely. What did you do? I uttered. So he did two things. He forged these documents that gave him the right to sell the stocks belonging to other people. and he uttered, and the utterment is, the forging is the literal writing of the document. The uttering is the presentation of that document at the Bank of England. That is, it goes out into circulation in the pursuance of fraud. And the forgery probably took place in Surrey, and so he's not convicted of that because he's in Middlesex Court in London, and but he is convicted of uttering, and they don't bother bringing another trial in Surrey for the forgery because he's sentenced to death. He stole somewhere around £170,000, and people were hanged for stealing a lot less than that. The execution happened in November, so just a couple of weeks after the trial. This morning at an early hour, this unfortunate gentleman fell a victim to the injured laws of his country. Perhaps it has not happened that so much interest has been excited on a similar occasion since the time of Governor Wall or the execution of Thistlewood and his associates. Governor Wall was a governor of an island near Senegal, and he was convicted of murdering one of his servants, one of his aides, by flogging him to death. That was in the early 1800s. Thistlewood and his associates were what we would now call terrorists. They were activists, radical activists, who were plotting to kill the entire cabinet of the government of the United Kingdom. So it gives you a kind of measure of how much this case caught the public imagination. There were 100,000 people at the hanging. It was a huge public spectacle, and people who lived opposite Newgate, the hangings were always just outside Newgate, and the people who, the prison, Newgate, and the people who lived opposite, they sold places at their windows for up to 40 shillings a place, which meant, and what that means to me is it's not only poor people who like to see people hanged. You know, that's a lot of money to shell out, a lot more than it would cost to go to the theatre or the opera. And so we're talking about the moneyed classes also going there for this spectacle of a man being hanged. Public entertainment. Next week I'll talk about this, the way that possibly Henry Fauntleroy was led into crime. But so far we say that this was poor Henry or terrible Henry, whichever one you want to go with, the story of a once respectable but ill-fated gentleman. That's this week in the Regency. I'm Elizabeth Layden. I'll see you next week in the Regency with the other half of the story.